time is it now in Greenland?
11. Usually
Oh,
I'm
not so bad. Okay.
yeah, usually I'm
It's not like the
tired
woman from Kenya that it's like 6 in the morning. To me, 6 or 5 in the morning is much harder than 11 at night. That's like, okay, we can handle that. All right, and we got Marlena, who we haven't seen for a few weeks.
Yes, I'm back.
Good, glad, and Larissa, and Danielle, and Dixie. Great, good, all right. Glad everyone's managed to make it. All right, so I was looking for something specific to do tonight and stumbled across, or in the search, my husband showed me a book that's really nice collection of many different things the Rebbe said in terms of Noahides. And I was like, wow, what a great collection of just all these different ideas. So I wanted to go through some of them. And just, start with these ideas. So these are all different ideas, lots of different things here, talking about just sort of general understandings of being a Noahide. So the first idea that the Rebbe discusses is this concept of, that's a little bit technical, but trying to explain it, is if we look originally, it seems that the concept of a Noahide really has to do with when the Jews are in Israel, with a temple, with a governing legal body. The Supreme Court of the Jews was called the Sanhedrin, with 71 elders. And at that time, if a person took upon themselves to keep God's 7 laws for mankind, they would go in front of what's called a Beit Din, a tribunal court, could be the smallest tribunal court of 3, and they would accept upon themselves formally this formal acceptance of keeping God's laws, of being a Noahide. And at that point, they actually received a certain title. They were called a GerToshav. Now, we had discussed this idea of a GerToshav, if you remember, a few weeks ago, that we explained that GerToshav is someone who's living in Israel, and as such, to live in Israel, if one is a non-Jew, one has to accept the Noahide laws, because if they live in Israel and they don't, they're killed. And therefore, in order to maintain residence in the Holy Land, which could be just for very pragmatic or personal benefit, they will keep God's laws for them because they want to live there, they don't want to die. So they accept these laws, and they're called a GerToshav, which means a Noahide who is a Toshav. Toshav means a settler, one who lives in Israel. But really, as this is written here, if you remember, then Maimonides went on to say that someone, though, who accepts these laws, not because he wants to live in Israel, but because he wants a relationship with God, he's on a much higher level than this GerToshav. That's the technical term for someone who is wanting to live in Israel and therefore needs to keep the laws. But he's actually someone that we called Chasseidei Umos ha'olam. Remember, we discussed that concept. Chasseidei Umos ha'olam means from the righteous of the nations, because this person is saying, God, I love you and I want to be close to you and I want to serve you. And this is how you want me to serve you, and I want to serve you this way. So that's, and Maimonides writes, Rambam Maimonides writes, that such a person has a special olam haba, has a special portion of the world to come, of the afterlife, not for a GerToshav, but not for someone who says, well, I want to live in Israel, and to live in Israel, I have to keep the laws. So I'll keep all of God's laws, fine, it's not so hard. But for someone who is doing it because they want a relationship with God, they want to be close to God, and they know this is what God wants from them. And this goes back to sort of a very basic understanding that I was thinking about this week in terms of something I'm not going to go into. But God's infinite and we're finite. And the gap between infinite and finite is infinite. So how do we bridge that gap? The only way we bridge that gap is by doing what God tells us to do. Because when he's telling us to do something and we do it, this creates a connection between the two of us. And that's the Hebrew word for commandment, which is called in the Hebrew a mitzvah. And for a Noahide, there are 7 mitzvos. And for a Jew, biblically, there are 613s, plus the rabbis added, I have no clue how many, tens and tens and tens of thousands. And those are all mitzvos. A mitzvah, which we translate generically to mean a commandment, is the root word safsa, which means a bond. Because every time God tells us to do something and we do it, there's a bond between the two of us. And that's what's the special beauty here. That God is saying, I do want to connect to you. And I'm giving you 7 roads. And of course, we know, because you're not newbies in this, that the 7 roads have many, many laws. And therefore, there are many, many opportunities to connect to God. And each time you have another opportunity to do a mitzvah, to do something God commanded you, you're bridging the gap between finite and infinite. Because you and God are becoming one through this mitzvah. And as Maimonides said, and as we discussed then when we learned it inside of Maimonides, which I thought was very powerful, that when you're choosing to do this, not because of a pragmatic need to live in Israel, but because you want a relationship with God, God says, wow, this is really special. This makes you Chasseidei Umos. Everyone in this class is not a GerToshav. You're not doing it to want to live in Israel. You're Chasseidei Umos. You're doing it because you want a relationship with God. And therefore, Maimonides says, and for you, there's a special Olam Haba, special section of the world to come, of the afterlife, as a reward for your serving me out of love. So that's the general background, which we more or less have discussed. The point here is that it seems almost as if you look at the writings of Maimonides, that, well, the only way to really be a Noahide is to go through the road of taking on an acceptance by a Beit Din of 3. But you can't do that nowadays, because you can only do that when there's a temple and when there's a Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, which doesn't exist nowadays. God willing, very soon. Tonight will be far too late, but hopefully tonight we can have the complete revelation of Mashiach, the Messiah, and we can have again the Sanhedrin, the Tribunal Supreme Court, and everyone can run and become GerToshavs. But nowadays you can't. So how does this work? So the Rebbe explains that if you look closer at Maimonides, there's really 2 options. There's the option of being a GerToshav, of because you want to live in Israel and therefore going through this tribunal court. And then there's the option of freely choosing to connect to God as a Noahide. And that's also completely legit. And that does not require an acceptance in front of a tribunal court, which wouldn't work nowadays, so you'd be stuck. What does it require? It requires your own personal acceptance. So for each one of you, when you committed, when you said, yes, I'm not like learning about it, thinking this is cool, thinking this is interesting, this is resonating inside, I finally feel I'm touching truth, this actually is something I've always known intuitively, but now I actually can read about. No, when you come to the point of saying, this is it, this is me, this is my life, I'm making a commitment. I'm making an acceptance. That's your acceptance of being a Noahide, of accepting upon yourself to lead this life and serve God as he wants to be served. So everyone nowadays has the ability to do this acceptance without a Beit Din, that tribunal court that, as is needed for this, doesn't function nowadays. But each one in their own heart, perhaps it would be even better to articulate it verbally, but for sure, just inside yourself, making this commitment to God. Yes, I'm your Noahide. Yes, I'm going to serve you as a Noahide. So I see we have 2 people on, but I don't know their names because they didn't change their names. Can you freely write it? Sometimes I know it doesn't let me check. Yeah, you're allowed to rename yourself. So just because I love knowing who I'm talking to. So who's the unnamed person on the Galaxy? I've got someone on a Galaxy and someone on an iPhone. I can show you my phone also.
Hey, it's Crystal. I'm here. I don't know
Crystal.
that I named anything though.
You don't know how to rename yourself?
Yeah, I thought that, yeah.
Usually it goes automatically. I always see your name. But if you go, like, if you hover over participants, where it says Galaxy and you hit more, there will be a place to type in your name.
Oh, good lands. I'll do that another time. It's me.
Okay, it's okay. Now we know Crystal owns a Galaxy. Okay, fine. And who has our iPhone? Someone is nameless, but with an iPhone. Everyone has to check their phone, see if they're nameless. Okay. Maybe whoever it is doesn't know that you're nameless. I don't know. If you hit the list of participants, you'll see your name's missing. It just says iPhone. I know sometimes people don't realize their name's not up because they're not looking at their names. But under you, it wouldn't say your picture, it wouldn't say your name. It just says iPhone. If you realize who it is, it's just always nice to know who I'm talking to. Okay. So any questions or thought on what I just shared? Now that I distracted everyone by identifying Crystal. Oh, wait, Dixie, you're the iPhone. Okay, fine. You see, because I saw your picture, I didn't realize that I didn't know it was you. Now I know it's you because I see your face. Okay, so Dixie is our mysterious iPhone. Any thoughts on any of this? Okay, so that's very interesting. Oh, you fixed your name, Crystal. Figured out how
I
to
figured
do
it out.
it. Was easier than I made it sound. Okay, I have a tendency to complicate things. Now, continuing this whole concept on the GerToshav, the Noach, there's an interesting discussion that the Rebbe quotes here, but to be honest, it's only a fragment of the talk. The talk has many, many pages. So I tried to look it over before the class, but I just didn't have time to go through it all. It's very, very detailed. But the Rebbe is raising a very interesting concept on a Noahide. So I'm going to just give it to you because I thought it was so interesting, but I'm putting a disclaimer here. This is not the end of the topic. So over the week, I'll learn the whole long dissertation. And if anything shifts in what I told you tonight, or if anything else I feel is relevant, I'll share it with you. But what the Rebbe shares now or explains is the history and how that affects you practically is originally, of course, with Adam, the first man, came laws, the commandments. 6 out of the 7 laws of Noah. Now we call them the laws of Noah, and we have 7, not 6, because after the flood, in response and reward for Noah and his family maintaining the survival of the animal species for a year on the ark, it was a 40-day and 40-night flood, but they were on the ark for a year. So the world was flooded for a year. So for a year, Noah and his family sustained all the animal kingdom. So in reward for that, man was given the right to eat animals, meaning until that time, the entire world was vegetarian. There was no such thing as eating any animals, no birds, no fish, no animals. It was just not, they just weren't allowed to. It had nothing to do with them. They didn't subside on anything animal. But after the flood, they were allowed to. And it became actually something good to do in the proper context. So with giving mankind permission for eating the animal life, God added another law, another commandment, which is not eating from the limbs of an animal while the animal is still alive. So at that point, we have 7. It's actually very special, the number 7. There's a special reason. Yes. So yes, thank you. There are 7, and there's really more than 7. What I mean by that is that there are 7 basic commandments. And this is the same thing within any of the laws for Jews. And I use the word interchangeably, and I shouldn't have. So thank you for catching me on that. There's the commandment, and then there are laws. So there are 7 basic commandments, right? The commandments are, the 7 overarching commandments are a belief in God and a renouncement of all idolatry, renouncement of all murder in any form, which includes, of course, abortion, a renouncement of all immorality, of anything that got any relationships between people that will be forbidden, either not in the context of marriage or between people that are related in a way that they can't have relationships, or between someone's married to someone else outside of that marriage, anything that God forbids in all those contexts. the law that we're just saying now, I said law again, the mitzvah, the commandment of not eating the limb of an animal while the animal is still alive, the commandment of not cursing, the commandment of not stealing, and the commandments of establishing courts of justice. Those are 7 commandments. Within each commandment, there are numerous laws that are fleshing out what does God mean by this? What does God mean by you can't steal? What constitutes stealing? What doesn't? What does God mean by you can't murder? What does that mean in terms of does one have to maintain life for someone who's in hospice or being, surviving through machinery? Are these all under the jurisdiction of this law? Yes. So what does that mean by courts of justice? What does one have to do? So within each of the commandments, there are hundreds and hundreds of laws that are all part of God's will for this commandment. So there's a wonderful book that's in English. It's called The Divine Code. I'll do show and tell and show it to you in a second. The Divine Code by Rabbi Moshe Weiner. I don't know if Rabbi Moshe Weiner speaks any English, but this was translated. He wrote it in the original in Hebrew, and this was translated to English. It's a mere 700 some pages. And in these 700 pages, he details for each of the 7 Noahide commandments, all of the laws. So this is very necessary, should be on every Noahide's bookshelf and to be reread many times because of course it's so many laws, remember. And of course, they're not always so simple to understand, but that's definitely a great place, a great start. There are many books in English on Noahides, but this one is really the best in terms of the law. What I'm doing here, and this is only in the Hebrew, is not law. It's more philosophy, theology around the Noahide. But it has many practical ramifications. And that distracts me from what I was trying to say. If I should only remember what I'm trying to say, would be great. We're talking about the history. We're saying that Adam was commanded with 6 laws. Noah received a 7th. And 7 is very significant. Everything that God does is very precise. Nothing is random. And the reason why you have specifically 7 commandments, even though you have 700 pages worth of laws, is because 7 is a very special number to God. It says, Kol hashvi'in chavivin. That's in Hebrew. And in English, what that means is all 7ths are beloved. There's a special dearness, a special beloved place by God for the number 7. Our generation, generationally, is considered the 7th generation for reasons I could or don't have to go into right now. But that makes our generation very special. If you have a lineup of things, the number 7, assuming the first is very special, the number 7th has a special dearness. We see this historically in various things that happened in terms of God and the number 7. So therefore, God specifically gave 7 laws because of 7 commandments, because the 7 commandments creates a dearness, specifically because it's 7. So the 7th was by Noah. Now, when God originally commanded the laws to Adam, they were obligatory on all mankind. And then when he added the 7th for Noah and his children, which became mankind, there were now 7 that are obligatory. What happened was, though, by the time God gave the Torah to the Jewish people in the year 2448, almost 2,500 years after creation, unfortunately, a lot of the world wasn't keeping the Noahide laws anymore. Meaning, originally they kept them. I mean, Adam obviously kept them, and he obviously instructed his children to keep them. And then people started like fizzling out. And then there was a great flood, which brought the world back into a recognition of God. And so Noah and his children were keeping them. And then again, it started fizzling out. So by the time we have 2,500 years after creation, almost 2448, most of mankind wasn't keeping these laws anymore. And it was as if God revoked them. God said, okay, I'm giving you a special opportunity. A commandment, as we were discussing earlier, means there can be a bond between the two of us. We can be one. That's so special. You're ignoring my commandments? You don't want to keep them? No problem. Forget it. Done. But God didn't really take them away. God gave them back in a different form. And the form was through the giving of the Torah. So when God gave the Torah to the Jewish people, God also gave the Jews the obligation to give mankind this relationship to God. So therefore, from the giving of the Torah, there's like a renewal of mankind's obligation of the Noahide laws, but in a different fashion. And that's why, going back to what I was discussing earlier of the GerToshav and the Noahide, my mom, but again, this is, I don't want to say anything definitive because I'm just giving you a very brief excerpt from a very long discourse of the Rebbe, which I want to study at length to make sure what I'm saying is exactly what was the bottom line conclusion of the Rebbe. This is what the Rebbe said in the beginning of the talk, but he could have led us in a different direction. But what the Rebbe seemed to be saying based on other sources is that when someone makes this acceptance, in law, there's a concept that I'm obligated and I do it. And there's a concept that I'm not obligated and I'm choosing to do it. And then there's people that obligate themselves. So it's as if before originally how God gave it, mankind was obligated. And mankind didn't follow through. And mankind sinned. And God said, forget it. Revoking all that. Now wiping all that away, we have a new phase. Torah is given to the world. The Jewish people should bring this light of God to the world, that the world should accept the Noahide laws. So when someone accepts the Noahide laws, it's almost as if they're taking upon themselves a commitment to something that otherwise they're not as obligated in. So there's a certain obligation, but not really the same degree of obligation because basically the whole world is ignorant. They don't know. Then God comes along and tells the Jewish people, hey, you go out. I've got 8 billion of my children out there that don't know about me. You go out and you've got to get them to know about me. And then when you take on yourself and say, God, I am accepting upon myself to serve you. That's in a sense shifting you to saying, I'm obligated. I'm obligated and I accept upon myself the obligation. So it seems, now again, this is where I don't want to say definitively one way or another because this was just an excerpt where it seems that there was a differentiation between some people's acceptance, put them in the category of they're obligated because they accepted, and other people's, well, it's not, they didn't really accept, but they're doing it without an obligation. So maybe doing it without an obligation might be all these people that like don't really know and therefore never really obligated themselves, but they're still doing it somewhat. But I'm not sure. So I don't want to say definitively. I'll let you know in a week. But I still thought this was very fascinating, this whole concept. And that's why I wanted to share it even before I finished totally learning the ideas. Any questions or thoughts on any of this? Marlena?
I have a question.
Sure.
It's related to Noah. It's kind of out there, but I've been seeing things that he lived during Atlantis, like he was an Atlantean. Have you read anything about that?
What would that mean?
Just the whole, I mean, it's very mysterious about the whole continent of Atlantis and the flood. And they're saying because of the flood, that's why Atlantis,
Flooded.
disappeared. Yeah.
Well, I don't know about that, but what I do know, which is a little different, but also the world fundamentally changed by the flood. And one thing that I do know, because this is written in the Talmud, is that before, like the zodiac signs, and every month there's the sign, there's the girl, there's the fish, there's the scales. Okay. So originally, where did those zodiac signs come from? They actually come because when God originally made the world, that's what happened. Every month, the stars would converge into a certain, what would look to mankind like a picture. So people on planet Earth are looking at the stars and they're saying, oh, it's a girl. Oh, it's a fish. Oh, it's scales. And that's how they knew and defined the zodiac sign of each month. So that's actually really what happened. And when the flood came, the flood changed many things. And one of the things that changed through the flood was this perfect conversion of the stars. So since the flood, the stars no longer do that. So if we look up, we don't see anything. But that is actually the true origins of the zodiac signs of every month. And that is something that changed because of the flood. So we were discussing this last week, actually, that, even though, if you read in the newspaper your horoscope or something, that's obviously ridiculous because whoever's writing it knows no more or less about that than you do. But in truth, there is a concept to it. There is a concept of the stars. There's a concept of the stars having power. There's a concept of looking in the stars and understanding things about the future. Of course, most people nowadays don't know anything, but there's really a truth to it. And this goes back to the original zodiac constellations that it used to be that you could look in the stars and literally see, which now we can't, but the power still exists. So there was definitely things that changed in the world through the flood. That could be, there's some speculation, I'm not saying yes or no, about the whole shifting of the continents. The whole concept that the vision that originally North America and South America were part of Eurasia. It was one landmass, and then something happened that caused it to drift, to separate and drift away. So that could have been something that happened by the flood, or it could have been something that happened after the flood, because there's people on the two continents before the Europeans came. So the native populations, how did they get there? Did they have ships that could get there? Or did they arrive before the continent shifted? If they arrived before the continent shifted, that means that break happened after the flood. Because the only people that survived the flood were Noah and his wife and their 3 sons and their 3 wives. So there was no people on North and South America that survived the flood. It had to, their migration had to happen after the flood. So that's a question.
I want to ask you one more question, because I read in some commentary somewhere that Og, the giant, survived, but that he was on top of the ark. Is that true?
Yes, it is true. He wasn't on top. It said he was hanging on. He wasn't on top. He would have probably crushed it. He was hanging on, and Noah would pass him food, and that's how he survived for the year. Yes.
Oh, wow.
He was the only giant that survived. It says all the giants besides him, they were making fun of God, and they were saying, "Oh, you think we're so tall?" I mean, the height of a giant we can't fathom, because it's not like a giant we think of in the storybooks. The giants were so big that it says that they, like, so to speak, wore the sun as their necklace. Not meaning that literally they wore the sun as a necklace, but I mean, if you looked up at them, it would seem that way, that their height was so high that it's as if you see the sun through their neck. Og, when you're referencing, he was so high that Moshe, who was 15 feet tall, and it said Moses was 15 feet.
Really?
Yes, he was 15 feet tall. That's what's recorded in the Talmud. He was 15 feet high, and he jumped 15 feet, which means now we're 30 feet above the ground. And he had a spear that he threw 15 feet. So this is now up 45 feet above the ground, and the spear pierced Og in his ankle. So the ankle of Og, meaning just above his foot, was 45 feet above the ground. So that's how high we're talking about here in terms of what this means. And he was just one. I mean, there were a number of giants, and they went on the tallest mountains, and they were like, "God, what's he thinking?" But it wasn't just water. It was such a flood high. That's why I'm saying it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, but the waters were there for a year. They were so many, many, many feet above the earth, the waters. So they were high, high, high above the mountains. So all of these giants also perished, besides Og, who had a different route, and he hung on to the ark, and Noah fed him, and he survived. Which, of course, is very interesting, because he was such a wicked person. He wasn't a good guy at all. But God wanted him as a player in the script, and therefore he kept him alive.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions on what I was saying thus far? Okay. So it's interesting, because actually it says in the, who were the giants? So the giants were, it says that mankind, we're talking here in the beginning of the world, between Adam and Noah were 10 generations. And in those 10 generations, unfortunately, mankind very quickly fell and moved very far away from God, and they were sinning. Because God was just giving them all good. The first millennium, the first 1,000 years was just so much kindness, and people lived for hundreds and hundreds of years, and people were absolutely healthy. And they just had no want, so to speak, and rebelled against God. Instead of appreciating all this was from God. It was a very chaotic time. So there were angels that it said were sort of like saying to God, oh, who's man that you created him? Look how horrible people man are. They're so sinful. How is this possible? And God said, really? It's not so easy being on planet Earth. Try it and see. And it says that some of these angels then sort of became fallen. They're referred to as the fallen angels that were brought down or sent down to Earth to become angels stuck on planet Earth. And these angels who had assumed human form on planet Earth, but they weren't really human, so they had different powers than a human, says they had relationships with human women, and from these relationships between these fallen angels and the human women came forth these giants. So people, but like their proportions, their heights was like nothing at all like a human, like way beyond. And it says they were all very evil and they were very, very destructive. So this was sort of God showing the angels like, you're saying, oh my gosh, look how man's behaving. Hey, if you were a man on planet Earth, you wouldn't be any better. Actually, you'd be a lot worse. So that's the source of the giants. So sometimes when we find in the Torah and the scriptures the term giants, it just means what we would assume as a giant, like a very, very, very big person. And that was later in history when we speak of giants, like in the times of David when there's giants and things like that. But the original giants that we speak of in Genesis and the early portions, those giants were actually like half non-human, half from these fallen angels. So that's why they were like so unbelievably massive. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? So when we speak, actually, it's very interesting because when God gave the Torah, so we're saying the giving of the Torah was very pivotal for all Noahides, because through the giving of the Torah, that's sort of when things shifted. And when the Jews had the obligation to bring God to the Gentiles, to the non-Jewish world, and when now the relationship to God is assuming a different relationship, because a relationship that's linked to Torah. So therefore, in the 10 commandments, there are exactly 620 letters. Why are there 620 letters? To imply the commandments, the mitzvahs. Because there are 613 mitzvahs that God gave the Jews, and 7 mitzvahs, 7 commandments that God gave the world, the rest of the world, non-Jews, and 613 and 7 is 620. So that's a really interesting concept, because it's really showing here that how much those 7 Noahide laws are valued, that they're literally put on an equal status. You have 613 for the Jewish world, you have 7 for the Noahides, and 613 plus 7 is 620, and that's the number of letters in the 10 commandments. Because every commandment has equal weight here. Every commandment is making a connection between God and man. And what's really interesting about that is you could say, but wait, certain commandments the Noahides have and the Jews have, it's the same commandment. So why did God write it twice, so to speak? Like, don't kill, or don't be immoral, or actually every one of the Noahide laws you see are really part of some law of the Jewish laws as well. But the answer is no. These are the laws for the Noahides. And going back to the laws in this 700-page book, as we've discussed, not every law is the same for a Jew and for a non-Jew. These are God's laws for the Noahides. And each commandment is unique and special and of value. And therefore, there are 620 letters in the 10 commandments and not 613, even though all 7 we could incorporate within the 613. Because each of these 7 is special. Each of these 7 is valuable. Each of these 7 is one of the commandments to the Noahides. So something else we speak about here, which is also very interesting, is the idea that a Noahide could become a prophet. A Noahide could have the divine presence resting on him, which really implies an incredible degree of nullification to God. Because prophecy, God's resting on the person, is even the whole idea of a commandment. Every time you do a commandment, there's a you are nullifying yourself to God when you do that commandment. So it shows here a really deep level of spirituality, a deep level of ability to totally nullify yourself to God, that these things are possible, that when you do a commandment, you are nullified to God. And if there's a prophet who's a Noahide, he is nullified to God at that moment, and God is literally resting on him. And this is completely as we see possible, which again is really very, very powerful, this idea. Because again, prophecy means such a degree of self-nullification, of making yourself totally a vehicle for God's voice to express itself through you. And this is possible for Jew, and it's possible for Noahide. It's a degree of really putting oneself on the side, again, that God can rest on them and speak through them. So then we can get into a topic, which is the whole idea of free choice. Now, why is the whole idea of free choice and reward and punishment something that's really need to wonder about? Because again, free choice is really, if you understand it deeply, a very aberrant idea. Meaning, our whole world is God. There is nothing but God. Everything is God. So as such, how can we ever have free choice? And if we don't have free choice, how could there ever be reward and punishment? In other words, if we're not freely choosing what we do, and God is making us or programming us to do this good or to do this bad, then how can he punish us or reward us? It's all him anyway. He wrote the script, and I'm following the script he wrote, so where would there be reward and punishment? So if there's a reward and punishment, of course, we know for the Noahide laws there is reward and punishment, then that implies there's free choice. But how could there be free choice? Meaning, we understand free choice as almost non-existent in this world. This world is so much God. He's taking up all the space, everything he's determining. So how can I freely choose anything? Everything's him. But we do speak of free choice. And how we understand free choice for a Jew is basically because of the special soul the Jew has that's of such God manner that just as God is freely choosing, so is the Jew. In a sense, of course, all our choices are going to run parallel to God's choices because we're not taking away his free choice, but we're still having free choice ourselves. But how does that work for Noahide? And that's a deep question, because if it doesn't work, then how could God reward or punish? But if it does work, how does it work? So there's different ways of understanding it. This is a deep question. There's different ways of understanding the answer to it. So basically, the concept would be sort of like, it's not so clear, to be honest, but it would be something along the lines of the inner godliness within the soul, within the soul energy of the Noahide, which is getting strengthened by the very act of the commandment. Meaning, let me back up a little bit to make this a little more clear, because this is a very deep concept. But meaning, for a Jew, do I have free choice in everything in my life? Not at all. No. Most of my life, a lot of my life is programmed by God. So where do I have free choice? The only place I have free choice is when it has to do with serving God. So if there be something in my life that has absolutely nothing to do with serving God, I don't have free choice there. I think I chose. All of us think we choose. but I really didn't. It was really a program. Let me try to script something, for example. So for example, let's say a person's deciding which university to go to. Let's say I'm contemplating 2 universities. And let's say there's absolutely nothing in the choice between the 2 universities that has anything to do with serving God. There's nothing to do with serving God, neither university choice. Then guess what? I'm not freely choosing. God decided where I should go, and that's going to be what I'm going to choose. What I'm going to think I'm choosing is following his script, because there's nothing to do with serving God, and therefore I don't have free choice. But when it has something to do with serving God, I do have free choice. Because the fact that here now becomes a spiritual issue, a soul issue, means that now I have my godly soul pulling me in one direction, my animal soul pulling me in another direction. I have to make a choice. And here I have this free choice to choose to do what God would want, or God forbid the opposite. But if it's something that has nothing to do with serving God, I don't have any choice in the matter. It's part of the program. It's determined by God, and I'm just walking his script. So for a Noahide, for everything in their life that has nothing to do with God, like everybody else's life, like my life, like all of our lives, it has nothing to do with serving God, you don't have free choice either. Nothing to do with God, don't have free choice. God determined it, and you're walking his road. You don't realize you're just blindly walking his road because you think you're choosing, you think you're thinking, you think you're processing. But just as so many things in our life, we know we didn't choose and just happened to us. So even the things we think we chose, we didn't choose. God determined, and it filtered down into our conscience to make that choice without really any choice on my part, because there's nothing to do with serving God. So therefore there's no choice. But wherever there's a commandment, the very energy and potential of the commandment lifts you up to a place of choice. So if it would have to do with eating what God wants or not, in the narrow place where God restricted your eating, suddenly this does have to do with God. This does have to do with a commandment. So the very energy of the commandment lifts me up and enables me now, from the spirituality within my soul, to make a godly choice or to choose the opposite. And so too with every situation that has to do with a commandment. So whenever there's a commandment, just as by me also, whenever it has to do with serving God, I have free choice. But also the Noahide, wherever there's a commandment, the energy of the commandment lifts up the Noahide to be able to actually freely choose. And that's why we find reward and punishment for the Noahide laws. Because within the laws, only within the laws, of course, the law itself, the commandment, gives you the ability for choice. Any questions or thoughts on this or anything else I just said?
A comment, I think. I
I'll
had a
take
friend
it.
who actually just brought that question up to me. Basically, it was worded, trying to think of how he said it. He asked, actually, if God, what did he say? If God knows everything that was, is, or is going to be, and how things are going to go, how exactly do you determine that people have this free will? And then how, that was the basis of his question.
Sure.
I'm
Well,
not
I'm
sure
so glad
how
that people
to.
are asking. That people are asking spiritual questions. That's wonderful. Instead of saying you, the non-believer, sometimes they're turning to you and saying you, the source of understanding God here.
He's not quite. Oh, he wants to hear answers. He's not quite open, I think, yet to. I don't know. He likes to have the discussions on religion
Right.
a lot.
That's
He himself
interesting.
doesn't believe. He calls himself atheist,
Agnostic?
or yeah, but he does like to have the discussions and ask the questions.
Okay.
I'm not sure how to explain this answer to him, though.
No. What I just told you is actually not answering the question, because I know that I can give you an answer to the question. That's this, but you're right. It's a related topic. So the question your friend was asking is a very valid question that many people ask. And I'll phrase it very simply. If God knows everything, how can you possibly say I'm choosing? God determined everything. So there's a lot of answers to that. The simplest answer is pre-knowledge is not equivalent to predeterminism. Meaning God's knowledge of the future, we can equate to my knowledge of the past, right? I know what happened in the past, at least in my life, if I remember it. So the same way I know past, God knows past, and God knows present, and God knows future. But my knowledge of the past didn't create the past. It's just an awareness. So similarly, now this obviously there are more answers and there are deeper answers, but this is a pretty simple answer. So the simpler the answer, the better, because it makes more sense to people. This is a very simple but very real answer that most people would be able to understand. So God's awareness of the future, I can equate to my awareness of the past. His knowledge of it doesn't determine it. He just knows it. And then you could give a parable of pre-knowledge versus predeterminism, which would be like let's say, I would say as a mother, I mean, I don't know if he's a father or not, as a mother, what I would say is a parable that works well for me. I'd say, listen, I have many children. And if I would decide today to give each one $1, I can tell you before it happens exactly what would happen to each dollar. The kid that's going to lose it, the kid that's going to put it in the charity box, the kid that's going to run to the toy store, the kid that's going to run to buy candies, the kid that's going to save it. Now, the fact that I could tell you beforehand, each one of my children, exactly what they're going to do with that $1 isn't determining what they're going to do. It's not causing it. I'm their mother. I know my kids. So I know who's going to do what, but I didn't cause it by my knowledge. I just know it. And if you want to test me, you'll see I'm right. So similarly with God, again, that's a sort of simplistic answer, but I like giving people simple answers because then they get them and like, oh, that makes sense. So God knows the future, but we're making choices. But he's aware of those choices. But his knowledge isn't creating our choices. It's just an awareness. So if he likes that, good, because that's something you can really get and you can really understand and make sense. And there are many, 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 many other answers. So it's a very classical question. He's in good company. Many people have asked that question. Many smart people have asked that question, and there are many, many, many answers. But that's
Thank you.
Sure. And you're right, it does relate, like that question sort of morphs into these ideas of choice and a reward and a punishment. I mean, these all can become one hodgepodge of a conversation. So your answer might lead him to some of these questions also. And they say, wait, I'll tell you in a week. Or you can WhatsApp me faster. That's fine also. Any other questions or thoughts or comments on any of this? Now within reward, just touching on the idea of reward, because we mentioned before the idea of the GerToshav, meaning the person who says, well, I want to live in Israel. This is the time when the Jews are running the show in Israel, according to Torah. And I want to live in Israel. And to live in Israel, I have to keep God's commandments. So fine, I'll keep God's commandments. I mean, they all make sense. They're all pretty nice. Moral life, I don't mind. I'll do them. And versus what we discussed, Chasseidei Umos ha'olam, the righteous of the nations, who the person who says, I want a relationship with God. I value God. I want to be close to God. And this is my ticket to being close to God. I want to do his laws. So for a regular GerToshav style relationship, which of course doesn't exist today, because today anyone that's choosing to do the laws is choosing to do them. But if we go back to earlier times, a person who kept the laws that way, there would be a response. God would reward the person, but it wouldn't be a very deep reward, just as his action's not very deep. But someone who's choosing to do the laws out of a love for God and therefore a desire to be close to him, that's a whole different category of reward. Because the first type of reward we could almost view as consequential for his actions. Meaning, if you don't clean your counters and it's warm and dirty, you're gonna probably have a lot of bugs munching on the food that you leave over. You might have a lot of ants or rodents. Now, we don't view that necessarily as divine retribution. It's just more like causal. Since I left out crumbs and it's warm, and so the ants came and they're eating them. It's a cause and an effect. So that could be, in essence, the basic level of reward, meaning when you do good, good follows. When you lead a moral life, good things naturally happen. When you're respectful to your parents, it leads to children that are respectful to you. When you're an honest person and you give charity and you respect the value of life and you respect the animal kingdom, and you're leading a good life, a moral life, then good naturally comes your way. That's just, we could view as the basic reward, just the natural consequence for making those moral good choices. But when it becomes a godly experience, when you're doing it out of an awareness that there's God, because of course, keeping the laws without the awareness of God isn't keeping the laws. If your friend next door never murders either, but she's not at all aware that that's because of God, then she didn't keep the law. She's not keeping the commandment. She's not serving God. She's a good person, but she's not serving God because she's not even bringing God into the equation. So to keep the mitzvah, to keep the commandment, it has to be because there's a God, and God said, I'm not allowed to do this. So when a person does it that way, because there's a God and this is God's will, and I want to connect to God, and therefore I'm choosing to serve God, then the concept of reward takes on a whole different level, because God's, if you will, attention to the person and focus is going to be so different than the person who's just doing it because it's what he has to do out of sort of convenience. And again, nowadays, I mean, every Noahide would be in that category, because obviously there's no Noahide in the world, I know of any situation, that they would be keeping the laws for any reason besides a true, sincere love of God and desire to be close to him. Okay, I guess we should stop at this point. Any other questions? Anyone else have any questions, comments, thoughts they'd like to share? Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming on all the way from Greenland. Have I got that right? Where now it's only a mere midnight by you. Hopefully you don't have to wake up too early for work tomorrow. But
Thank you.
we
That was really great. It was really
good.
it was
Thank
really
you. What
insightful.
language do you speak there? Because I'm sure it's not English as the native.
It's Greenlandic, which is an
Greenlandic.
Inuit native Eskimo language. But we also speak Danish,
Okay, and English on the side.
and English is a third language. Yeah.
Okay, which you seem to know very well.
My husband is Canadian. So,
Okay, good. So you have lots of practice. So Larissa wants to know how to pronounce your name.
think of ironing and walking. Ironing walk.
Ironing walk.
Perfect.
Okay, you got it. Your
Yeah.
first word in Greenlandish.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Well, we're really happy you joined us at the late hour, and we really appreciate it. And we're really happy everyone else that came as well. And thank you so much. And there's really, again, how did you learn about the Noahide concept? From internet?
Well, no, we moved to Greenland again. We lived in Canada for a while, and we moved here about 3 years ago. But before we moved, my husband's cousin had been, I don't know, he had known, he didn't believe in the Trinity. And then he was starting to learn about the Noahide stuff, but I didn't really know about it. So he challenged my husband and said, you should research about the Trinity. And then I think my husband studied all that in secret for about a year without really telling me. So when he told me about it here in Greenland, it was a little bit like, what? You don't believe in Jesus anymore? Or what? You don't believe that Jesus is God? What is that? And it took me about a week before I even wanted to discuss it with him. Yeah. So it was from my husband. He's the one who started, and from his cousin.
It was from his cousin.
It was from his cousin who also newly was learning about all this. So
thank you. So that brings out the point. Yeah, and now, okay, where's now holding with your cousin and your husband? Yeah, let's hear the story.
Yeah, and now, now his parents are also Noahides.
your husband's parents or your husband's cousin's parents?
My husband's parents.
Wow. All from
Yeah.
the cousin?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so this was what I wanted to bring out. So thank you for being my commercial. So I hope everyone paid good attention and they're not like, oh my gosh, it's after 9. Why is this still going on? But rather, obviously a story is more interesting than anything else, because this is what I sort of hoped she was going to say, even though I didn't know what she was going to say. But because her husband's cousin cared enough, he made a comment from his heart to her husband that sparked her husband enough, or challenged her husband enough, or made her husband feel, I don't know, if he's so certain, maybe I should look into this. That made a transformation in her husband's life, made a transformation in her life, made a transformation in her in-laws' life. So just understand, everyone on this call can be as much as noble and as much God's emissary as your cousin, because all of you have people that you could, each person in their own way, share, challenge, give an insight, be a source of knowledge, and really save people's lives, really help people uncover their own relationship with God. That's the most precious, beautiful thing in the world. And just imagine, think of like when we have the complete revelation of Mashiach, of Messiah, and it'll be like, people say, why didn't you tell me? And you'll be like, I tried, you weren't interested. No, it's not true. Yeah, I would have definitely listened if you said anything. You're thinking, oh gosh, how many times I said to you? But we really all really have to understand that every one of us has an enormous power to help so many people. Who are those people going to be? The people in your world, the people that you have a connection to, the people that you can talk to, that will or won't look like they're listening. I don't know if your husband said, oh my gosh, thank you for leading me to the truth. Or he said, what in the world are you talking about? What are you saying this craziness for? But it doesn't make a difference what he said. It still penetrated his heart or his mind enough to say, I've got to be honest here. I've got to check it out. And that's true for everyone, for every one of us. So thank you for sharing that. That was so beautiful. That was so powerful. And hopefully all of us are going to walk away a little more inspired and a little more confident that we have people that we can also help. Because every one of us, God has entrusted. If you think there's 8 billion mankind, and you, God chose to know. So every one of us, God has entrusted, and we have the ability to help many, many other people. Okay, have a wonderful week. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining.
Shavua tov.
Shavua tov. Shavua tov.